Today we're going to talk about chapter 8 of this called Build the City. And I have my computer here and everything, but I did not write down any notes for this one because this one, in my opinion, is very complicated and there's a lot going on in this. And so I don't want to make it too long, but I will have to break it down line by line, stanza by stanza, because there's just a lot going on with this. And I can say on hand that number 8, number 9, and number 10 are kind of a triumvirate of sorts for the album. Um, all three of those fit in together simply because they're all pretty much in the same place. So, what is the literal meaning for this song? Well, it's about a city. It's an unnamed city. It's just a city in this world that the protagonist lives in. He, at the end of chapter 7, like I said before, returns to civilization, and the first thing he finds is a city. So, for example, the first stanza says, "I only wanted a tearless field to rest my bones. Instead, I found a dystopia which called me home. Lonesome, I desired others in my likeness, but gilded graven images were openly called Your Highness." So, Tearless Field, uh, obviously a reference to uh, the Gospels, really, and Jesus' parables, and gilded graven images, gilded mean gold, and graven images, that sort of idolatrous sort of thing. So what's really going on here is first line, he's really just wanting a place to rest, wanting to find a home. But excuse me, right away he finds out that it isn't the place that he thought it was going to be. It wasn't a utopia. It's obviously a dystopia. So yeah, literally a city. Allegorically speaking, uh, I would say that it could represent my own city, perhaps, or like just the region in general. North Carolina, that's where I'm from, Greensboro. Could be that. Morally, mm, let's say the entire United States, perhaps. Sure. Anagogically, which, as I mentioned early on, is like the spiritual meaning. It represents the institutions of churches, evangelicalism. It doesn't really matter. It could be Catholicism, Greek Orthodox, like just an institution of church. And then personally, well, we'll get to that. Um, so let's talk about the second stanza. It reads, "They were bourgeois industrialists formulating God in machines. They were the proletariat apotheosizing ghosts in a kiln. They both babbled of Nimrod turning wheat farms to concrete slabs where all gathered in the name of their king." And king, want to point out, is not capitalized, which purposefully means that it's not referring to Jesus in the spiritual sense. Um, so when it comes to the more allegorical and personal meanings, I have to point out that I wrote this song back in September or so of 2016. So the last 2 years, it, don't interpret it that way. Um, this isn't about civil unrest, any of that. Okay. I think, and this is my perception, is that some people could look at this song and infer that I am a leftist, which is not the case whatsoever. I'm very far from being a leftist. Um, technically, uh, I'm very much a libertarian. That's what I'm politically registered as. Um, for I don't know, ever since really probably about the time that I turned 20 years old, um, I just don't identify with either the Democratic or Republican parties. I will definitely say that I lean more towards Republicanism. Um, but to kind of put it in terms, one of my close buddies, shout out to my dude, Mikey, once told me years and years ago that he would describe me as being what was it, morally conservative but socially liberal. That was his description of me, and I think that's a fairly ideal statement. I remember years and years ago listening to a podcast that I used to follow every week, pretty much from the guys who they didn't write it, but they helped edit and publish the popular book, The Shack. And it was a podcast called The God Journey. It still goes on. I just kind of got out of it, honestly. But I remember there was a episode where they were talking about reading what's his name, Roger Williams, the a lot of his work, and he was the founder of the Rhode Island colony. And from what little history that I know, he was basically kicked out of New York. I want to say he was a Quaker, kicked out of New York, and he pretty much rode on a horse in the middle of winter um, and founded Providence, Rhode Island. And I've never found this quote, whether he actually said this or not, or if this was kind of the God Journey podcast, those guys uh, just kind of giving their own commentary about it. But they kind of made this statement that has always resonated with me, that something to the extent that Roger Williams, his attitude was basically in the statement of, oh, for 6 days a week, I'll be at the town council or whatever, fighting for your rights to believe, do whatever you want to. And then on the seventh day, I'll be in the town square telling you why you're wrong. And I was like, that dude, yeah, that makes sense to me, of just this kind of libertarian ideal of, look, you can make choices, you're an adult, there are consequences and everything, but um, yeah, let's be adults here and have individual rights, because I'm very much about individualism over, say, collectivism. And that's honestly, that's a topic that I think I've come to conclude on in the last 2 years. Honestly, that's been on my brain a lot over the last 2 years. Um, but in a lot of ways, that kind of means that I might, to some people, be considered a, say, a classical liberal. um, which to most Republicans that means that you lean left. But I've kind of discovered, or this is my personal opinion when it comes to American politics, but our country has always, at least in my opinion, leaned right. You just have different degrees of the right, conservatism or whatever. Um, and so, in my opinion, say the Democratic Party actually is just slightly right. They're a little closer to center, whereas, Republicanism's getting farther away from center. And there's nothing wrong with that, in my opinion. Um, that's just, yeah, my opinion and my belief when it comes to that. Um, so, me saying, oh, maybe I'm a classical liberal, uh, what does that even mean? And from what I can gather based on actual like dictionary definitions is that I'm basically a champion for individual rights. And it's kind of simple as that. Um, so all of that is to say that I'm not a leftist at all. Um, I have friends who are Marxists, communists, whatever. Um, some of them I truly respect their views. Um, yeah, like for real. I disagree with them, but yeah, I can see where they're coming from, and in a lot of ways, one of my friends, we were talking about this stuff a few months back, and he kind of pointed out that even within, say, Marxist, communist camps, that there's some who have kind of emphasis, foundation, whatever you want to call it, on individualism, and others who are definitely more collectivist, and that there is a divide there. Um, and this friend, being more of an individualist, we have more in common in some of our views, I guess. Although, I guess how we would come about, you know, the ends of all that stuff is where we would differ. But it's like he said, I just am trying to remember what he said exactly, but something along the lines of like, dude, we want the same things of, being loved, having, a decent life, being provided for, shelter, etc. And so like, yeah, he's my dude. Like, love that dude. Um, and then there's other that their views are just unrealistic to me altogether, and that's all I'm going to say about that. Um, but I'm really hammering this down because I use essentially Marxist language in this, second stanza here of bourgeois, industrialists, and the proletariat. Um, and my personal opinion when it comes to these particular words, um, I've heard it said that Marx is very much, whether you agree with his like political ideology or not, he was very much an expert when it came to human behavior and human nature. And for me personally, the words bourgeois and proletariat are just words that describe human nature, um, human behavior, and just like a sociological aspect of it. And it simply means you have the bourgeois, the people in power, the people who have resources, And then you have the proletariat, the common man who doesn't. Um, that to me is just kind of a universal truth. You're always going to have someone who has, and you're always going to have someone who doesn't have. Doesn't matter what the governmental system is, you're always going to have it. You could be a utopic, communist, whatever. You're still going to have that because, hey, somebody over here only made 5 cents, but they saved a penny of that and lived off that, whereas some dude over here made a bunch of choices, drank away his 5 cents, and then went in some kind of debt or whatever, um, ended up with nothing. So you've got somebody over here uh, who naturally is going to have more simply because they saved their money. Um, should a person be allowed to do that? Well, obviously, I believe so, but when when does that become personal property versus private property? Well, when I guess they try to buy a business, maybe, or I don't know. I don't want to debate that too much here. Um, just kind of pointing it out. Sorry about the interruption. I had to take care of a little emergency, plus get some tasty diet Dr. Pepper. Uh, ad placement. So back to topic because I know this is getting long. Um, so what I'm talking about with they were bourgeois industrialists uh, formulating God and machines. That was a line that I wrote down early on in the writing process. A couple of these lines, the proletariat line as well, it was just a phrase that sort of came to me one night, probably at work, and I wrote it in my notes app or whatever on my phone for later. And what those two lines are, and everything dealing with politics, because yeah, this is a very politically charged song. I just don't think it is cut and dry as some people are used to hearing, if that makes sense. That what I'm maybe kind of aiming for in this song is talking about politics in a more abstract sort of way or poetic or something along those lines of something more than just the Democratic and Republican parties of the United States of America. Like I don't really care about that in this song. What I'm talking about in those two lines is kind of together in context. I'm actually saying, like, yeah, there are two sides in this fictitious world that the main character is in. Um, you've got the proletariat and the bourgeois, right? Simple as that. Um, but neither side is completely right because I think, and this is my opinion again, um, bourgeois people, those who have, tend to formulate God in machines. Um, really, the things that we as humans build with our hands is, and there's a line later in the song that kind of ties in with this, but you know, the ancient Greek concept in like plays, especially of the Deus Ex Machina, which is a literary concept nowadays of you have a story and you need a final resolution to it, but how do you get there? Oh, some like miraculous thing happens. It's the God machine, and I think a lot of people who would be considered bourgeois, let's say, um, they tend to formulate that sort of idolatry, if you want to call it that, in things we make as humans, um, whether that's capital or whatever. But like I said, not a Marxist. Um, so this isn't like a knock against capitalism at all. Um, just leave that there, because then you've got the proletariat who apotheosize ghosts in a kiln. Um, that was just a line, once again, wrote on my iPhone, and I like the sound of it, but what does it mean? Well, I think the common man has this misconception and tendency to deify uh, people who are dead, hero worship, essentially. And I think a lot of leftists tend to do that nowadays. And just as, like hardcore capitalists will, deify the things of their hands, or, I mean, let's face it, like Old Testament literature, prophetic literature, Isaiah, all that stuff talks about, nation of Israel trusting in chariots and iron and stuff like that. Well, of course, like we don't deal with that today because we're in this postmodern state, right? But it's the principle's the same, of trusting in something that is just man-made. Simple as that. Um, so they both babbled of Nimrod turning wheat farms to concrete slabs. Um, and like I'm not like some crazy environmentalist um, by any means. Like, yeah, not that, but you know, especially kind of where I live, you see, I mean, growing up, there was a lot of like farmland and just open fields and stuff like that. And now you have housing developments. And I mean, it's just a sign of industrialization, I suppose. And obviously, building homes and owning land isn't a bad thing at all. But here we are again, poetic language. Um, they both babbled of Nimrod, like I mentioned already, like a couple of times. Nimrod in the Bible, he's the great grandson of Noah, the dude from the ark. Yeah. Um, Nimrod uh, formed a few different cities in Middle Eastern region, but most notably, he's basically the founder of Babylon, which Old Testament literature people know that Babylon's not a great place. But specifically, too, it kind of pretty much says in Genesis that he was the mastermind, if you will, uh, behind the Tower of Babel. Um, so we're all gathered in the name of their king, and like I said at the beginning, lowercase k, and that's who their king is in this, whether they're proletariat, whether they're bourgeois. It's all about the Tower of Babel, all about their king being just this earthly man. Okay. So then, third stanza, his great grandfather Noah. So that's the context of why he's their king. His great grandfather Noah, talking about Nimrod. And this is where it gets interesting. Survived the Azusa Street flood of those cast to four winds. Now, what this is obviously talking about is the Azusa Street revival. I'm not an expert when it comes to that stuff. I kind of, this may piss off some of my Pentecostal friends out there, whatever, but I kind of tend to think that perhaps those in Pentecostal circles romanticize that movement. Um, I think that's a human tendency, is to just romanticize things that we really don't know as much about. And my opinion is that many of us, if we went to the revival, if we were alive back in, what was it, 1905 or somewhere in the early 19 or 19, yeah, 1900s. Um, we may be like, this is weird, or may not even be as much hype as we would expect. But then again, who knows? I don't know, obviously. Um, but, Pentecostalism, charismatic, whatever, it goes back to the Azusa Street revival. Um, so, what happened at Azusa Street revival? Well, we know that it split up. I mean, you go to most Pentecostal churches who mention it in some kind of sermon. I've heard people say basically, well, it needed to split up because it would have just continued, you know, happening there, and then it would not have spread, which I suppose is true. But somewhere in, I've got a bookshelf over this way. Um, Somewhere on it, I have an old college textbook for this spiritual formation class that I pretty much was forced to take as part of my degree in college. Um, and it's, I think, called Streams of Living Water or something like that. Um, and it's basically this book about five different so-called traditions within Christendom, um, and it just outlines those different traditions. And we're not talking about denominations or movements here, but like more kind of generalized, like Pentecostalism or evangelicalism, which is has nothing to do with the modern current usage of evangelicalism. It kind of broadens it, is throughout kind of history sort of thing, and less about something that would be more considered, a, what's the word I'm looking for, like a religio political movement, if you want to call it that. Um, and one of the chapters dealt with Pentecostalism, and specifically um, the Azusa Street revival, which the guy that kind of started that, wish I had the book on me right now, but I think his name was William Seymour, but somebody correct me if I'm wrong, like in the comments or something like that. But I remember reading this book when I was, in college, and coming across the stark reality of why the revival broke apart. And basically, what it came down to was the founder dude, William Seymour. His He was a black dude, okay, and his like mentor was like some white dude. I don't even remember the guy's name, but he was from like Dallas, Texas, or somewhere in Texas. And he was invited to speak at the revival. He was like, cool, I'll be there. Shows up and is flabbergasted by this revival because it's being led by a black guy. And so basically, the book points out that racism was why the Azusa Street revival broke apart, because his mentor or whatever comes up and is like, no, there needs to basically be a white guy in charge instead of a black dude. And he starts coming against what God is doing at Azusa Street, which is, I'm not going to say the word that, I shouldn't be saying as a Christian, but you can fill in the blanks of being, messed up. Um, so moving on back to the stanza. After some forgot the color of blood, today race isn't the hue which paints this town its slaves. Now, I recognize now that that is very strong language. Now, my personal opinion of this and what this is really talking about, in between the lines, is the fact that racism is bullshit. I'll just go on and say it. Racism is bullshit. Racism doesn't belong in the Christian church, period. End of story. I don't need to go into critical race theory or any of that. Um, there's just no need for that. Um, Personally, I need to study more into CRT, but I don't buy into it personally. Just my opinion or whatever. One of the basis for that opinion is simply that, from my understanding and in doing some research and reading into like actual CRT textbooks, is that there's at least the implication at the beginning that the idea of universal law when it comes to ethics, or I guess more like actual political laws, shouldn't necessarily apply. And I'm very much a yes, there needs to be universal law that has nothing to do with any type of characteristic, intersection, intersectionality, any of that. There's universal law. It applies to everyone. That's one of my like base foundations for ethics. Um, you may disagree with that. I don't care. Okay, just I'm just being honest here. Like, believe whatever you want to. I'm not gonna knock it. Um, but this is pretty much where I stand. And if you don't like it, then don't watch this or buy the music. Like, doubling down on that. Okay, like let's be adults here. Is kind of my thing. Like, I'm just giving my opinion. So if somebody's getting pissed off hearing me say this, then I'm not sorry. Um, my point: racism is bullshit. That's just plain and simple. Um, but my personal opinion and belief when it comes to a lot of that stuff, and even in this like fictitious world that I'm talking about here, even if we're in a so-called utopia where there is no racism or anything, um, all forms of racism are eradicated. Like, of course, I want that to happen, but then you've got um, instead socioeconomics define a man his worth. Um, Green is really the color that matters in this world. Um, that isn't anti-capitalist, anti-communist. Like, it doesn't matter. Okay, those views, just, it's simple, people. Like, green matters. Wu-Tang Clan. Cash rules everything around me. Cream, get the money. Dollar, dollar bill, y'all. Do I need to explain it more than that? Um, so instead, socioeconomics define a man his worth. At least in this fictitious world, racism has, I guess, been eradicated. It's something that's ended. It's part of the history, part of the like building of the Azusa Street flood, all that kind of stuff. But at the current state, it's money and socioeconomic status that defines people, their worth within this city and its society and civilization. He built this city on rock and roll. At the end of chapter 7, there's a sound clip that plays off of that. Because I wanted to just mess around with that concept. I can't stand that song, honestly, but wanted some like internal rhyme and just kind of play off of the "we built this city" sort of concept. And others cast it onto a solid rock and soul. So that's kind of reference to just Christianity period of rock and soul. But we built this city on stocks and highway tolls against lone travelers invited to wedding banquets, reference to, Jesus and the parables, and Samaritans covering the infirm under blankets. Same thing. So, taxation and stuff like that against people who are actually helping other people. Um, then there's this kind of segue in the middle of the song that says, because the price of this city they said wasn't free, but the fee for the city he says was paid by me. Well, who's the he? Um, I think there's different interpretations. It could mean Nimrod, um, as being the king of this world, so to speak. Um, whether you want to even go that further with that of the devil, or whether that means some earthly man, okay, whichever. Or it's reference to Jesus, which, yeah, I think it's double meaning of he in that sense. Um, but moving on, the next stanza says, they called this civilization the cradle to become our bed. Um, yeah, I don't really have anything to say of that particular line. I think it says enough for itself. A great comforter for all with heavy heads. Okay, that's referencing that the civilization kind of becomes a substitute, if you will, of the Holy Spirit. In their Babel, the city of Babel, the rubble of fallen towers of Babel, Babble. So play on words here of just babbling. Now they speak angels' tongues, yet no meaning and interpretation. Um, so Pentecostalism, charismatic theology, people pray in tongues, speak in tongues, whatever. Glossolalia, that's like the technical term for that thing. Personally, I believe in it, I practice it. Um, Disagree with me if you will, I don't care. Um, I don't want to make a big deal out of it because it's something that I believe is very, very personal to me. And I don't like going around in like a church service praying in tongues or anything like that. I'd kind of keep my voice down if I was going to do that. And the reason for that was in a lot of what this song, the inspiration behind it, partially, is my time in college. Um, some of the stuff got weird. I don't want to explain too much, but one of the things, we had chapel services like twice a week, um, usually like Wednesdays and Friday mornings. And, you've got like roughly 5,000 students or so gathered in this big, like, cathedral like place on the campus. And at least like every other week it seemed, um, after like the praise and worship music, somebody would come to the stage, whether it was one of the deans or what the president at the time or whoever, and ask the student population to start praying in tongues. And so that used to really grind my gears. Takes something that's very individual and personal and makes it very much a collectivist, bastardized sort of thing. That's my personal opinion, but I'm sticking to it. It became this wall of sound. I don't even want to call it that because, wall of sound, going back to Phil Spector and the Beatles and stuff like that. Um, but it just became this babble that seemed to be all around, and thousands of students praying in some unknown language all at once. Um, but it wasn't like the like charismatic church that I grew up in, where somebody might pray in tongues or whatever, and then somebody stands up and gives an interpretation, like a prophetic interpretation. And yeah, that stuff can kind of be weird at times, I admit, but there was this like I, I don't know if he was a bishop. Like my dad worked with him. He was this really cool black dude who like dude probably was like a legit prophet. Um, like I had a lot of respect for the dude. Like he was cool. He worked with my dad and stuff like 20 years ago too. Like he was a cool dude, and he was this like older black gentleman, always like showing up in like the orange suit and stuff like that. And like me and I think it was my buddy Mikey like stopped him one time and was like, dude, why are you like always dressed like that? Like we just wonder like just straight up like we're two white dudes that we couldn't pull that off. And he was like, y'all, like I do what I do because like I'm a single guy, like I want to look my best, and I take care of myself. And I was like, heck yeah, dude, that's what's up. But like, dude, I can remember so many times where somebody would like pray in tongues or whatever, and it would be kind of like weird and silent for a second, and then he would just stand up and be like, thus saith the Lord, and like just deliver like something that was like legit and real. And it was like, dude could have dropped the mic after that, if that was like a thing back at the time. But I point that out because like that dude was legit, and I totally respected him. He was a godly man. And that sort of thing didn't happen where I went to school. Um, it was just a clamorous noise of thousands of students all at once. And so, yeah, I took a swing at that in this song, speak angel tongues, yet no meaning and interpretation. Okay. That's actually from, Pauline literature right there. So, um, then moving on, it says, with invented hierograms. Uh, People who pray in tongues at church, I know plenty of them. I had nothing against them. Okay, I just want to point that out right now so I don't piss off too many people. Um, like, if you're okay with that, then I'm okay with that. Just don't let it become a clamorous noise, is all I'm saying. Okay, but moving on, with invented hierograms as Great Depression preventions, hierograms, like these kind of symbols or whatever of protection, or kind of gets into some like weird mystical stuff, I suppose. But humanity tends to kind of fall in that direction in general. Just saying. As Great Depression preventions to prevent bad things from happening, and a deus ex machina, like I said before, for disbelief's suspension. So a suspension of disbelief. Once again, another literary reference. A great recession's the pension of all that's sown. So even trying to prevent bad things from happen, you end up with a great recession anyway. Are we talking about like a literal one? Maybe, not necessarily. Maybe a spiritual one. Um, Believing themselves as gods, an autotheistic coup d'etat. The word autotheistic, you might find it in a dictionary, you might not. Um, Now, what I realize is that there is a theological implication of that, of autotheistic theology, or uh, no, that's not it. Sorry, trying to think off the top of my head. I know it is a like positive reference towards Jesus and his ministry. Can't think of the exact definition off the top of my head, but um, it does deal with Jesus. Um, so, autotheistic coup d'etat, one of the interpretations there is that it's an attempt to, coup Jesus and who he is as, the Son of God. But also it's autotheism, and what I kind of lean more towards in context here is that it so there's this amazing band called the Faceless. Brain for it for a second. The Faceless, like it's tech death, like dude is sick on guitar. I can't remember his name, but he's just sick. And they have this like amazing album called Autotheism. And it's kind of loosely a concept album, but basically the definition of autotheism with that is man becoming his own god. And so that's the other thing. It's a reference to that album. Um, Obviously, I don't believe in man becoming God. No. Um, and that ties in again with the bourgeois and proletariat lines at the beginning of, apotheosizing and all that, circular there. Um, so the last two lines in the song by saying a coup de grace, which is a mercy killing for those who don't know, comma, remnants or diasporas. So, you know, the casting to the four winds, so to speak. Going back to the beginning, my God, who will lead the captives free? And so that is where the song ends. My God, who will lead the captives free? And just going with the rhetorical question right there. And I think it ties in with where the next couple of songs go. But I want to go back to personal meaning. So I mentioned, my college. Um, but it's not as much about that as it is about, and it's still not like 100% about this other place, but this song really in the back of my head, and maybe even to the degree of I was very conscious when I wrote this, is kind of dealing with a church that I used to be a part of years and years ago. I don't want to badmouth anybody, tear anybody down. I've come to terms with that stuff a long time ago, but for a few years, I after I made the journey kind of thing, visiting a bunch of different churches and organizations and cults and what have you, as like I mentioned it a few chapters ago. Um, I settled in a church, met a lot of really great people, some of who may actually be watching this and who were still involved in that church. And like amazing, like men and women of God. Um, and I have nothing against the leadership there, but I didn't really fit in there. For I think a lot of it was on my end. Honestly, I can honestly say that now. But I showed up at that church with my own ideas of kind of how church should go. Um, and I guess I wanted some things to change or whatever. And I knew I couldn't make it happen, but, I was vocal enough, I suppose, which I think it pissed a lot of people off. Um, and a lot of that was just simply my having questions of, we're going to move from one facility to a bigger and better one, and being the person, like literally the only person that was like, I'm not sure we should do this sort of thing. Um, and then to make a long story short, I remember the pastor one night during one service, he made the statement that he had like 5 people on his heart that week and wanted to call 5 different people up. And I was one of them. And he said to me in front of the entire church that he needed me, that the church needed more people like me. And a year later or so, I was pretty much sitting on the back row, completely uninvolved, basically every week, because I wasn't opinionated, because maybe I was wrong, but I stuck to certain things. Um, and I think there was some cult of personality going on in that institution. I think, and a lot of this has to do with things that I was told or that happened after I left that place. Um, that there were some things that I just disagree with, where it was, the best way I can put it was, maybe there was some empire building instead of kingdom building. And like I said, I don't want to knock anybody, like, I don't harbor any resentment, but at the same time, and I don't want that to be a but statement, because, some people say, well, but means that just negate the very first preposition or whatever. Like, I don't want it to be that. Like, if I walked in that place today, like, I would want to, like, give people a dap, or, like, high five or whatever. Like, I don't want to be petty. Um, just saying, at the same time, I think there were some very unhealthy practices in that church, and that at the end of the day, it was a multicultural church. So racism was not a problem there, in my opinion, at all. That's a good thing. But instead, we're talking about socioeconomics, and we're talking about empire building and things of that nature. And I think a lot of this song deals with that. And so I know I've gone a really long time today, and I apologize if you've made it to the end, and give yourself a gold star. But yeah, this is a pretty political song, and yeah, I make no apologies for it. So if it ticks you off, well,
Unto a solid rock and soul, but we built this city